wired empire, the world where the internet was born in the 19th century. In another strand of time, the modern world did not begin with silicon, but with steam. The spark of our age, the digital revolution, was struck, not in the glassy corridors, California, but in the soot-choked alleys of industrial London. There, beneath gaslit lanterns and the ever-present hiss of pressure valves, a different kind of future unfolded, one where information flowed through copper veins long before the first transistor blinked to life. It began not with a single mind, but a convergence of obsessions. It was the 1830s, a time of furious invention, restless minds, and collapsing boundaries. While Charles Dickens penned serialized chronicles of a changing society, deep in a smoky Edinburgh workshop, Alexander Bain, a self-taught clockmaker, an engineer, was consumed by an idea too strange for polite company. What if writing could be transmitted across wires? Bain's earliest prototypes looked more like torture devices than tools, coils wrapped around wooden spools, vibrating metal arms coated in chemicals, damp paper that sizzled when shocked. But in 1837, he unveiled what would later be called the electrographic recorder, the world's first fax machine, though no one used the term. With it, simple messages and rough sketches could be reproduced at a distance. At the Royal Society, the scientific elite received Bain's invention. With the usual mix of admiration and condescension, they clapped politely. They smiled at the novelty. But in the back row, Charles Babbage did not smile. He leaned forward, eyes narrowed. Babbage had long been obsessed with his analytical engine, a monstrous mechanical calculator that few truly understood. But Bain had done something different. He had moved meaning across space. After the demonstration, Babbage found Bain and invited him to tea. That conversation would last 3 days. In Bain's precise but limited engineering, Babbage saw potential. In Babbage's theoretical brilliance, Bain saw application. And in both men, the dream of something larger began to take shape. Not just communication, but computation at distance. A machine that could send thought, not only words, but logic. Ada Lovelace, Babbage's collaborator and mathematical muse, joined their efforts. She didn't merely write code, she wrote purpose. She imagined networks not as pathways, but as minds. To encode is to translate spirit into structure, she wrote. While Bain built new transmission tools using electrochemical reactions and twin-wire systems, Ada began sketching syntax ways to represent not just letters, but conditional instructions, queries, loops of reasoning, the foundations of what she called living logic. By 1845, they had created the first prototype of a thinking, transmitting machine, a hulking brass monstrosity driven by steam, guided by wheels and valves, and controlled by punch cards. They called it the interpreter. It could not think like a human, but it could compare, and that was enough. Bain's enhanced telegraphic network allowed one interpreter to send queries to another, not merely messages, but instructions. The British Empire, ever hungry for speed and advantage, took notice. Messages that had taken weeks by ship could now traverse continents in hours. Test cases proved staggering. Battlefield updates sent to generals in minutes. Commodity prices updated from Calcutta to London by day's end. By 1850, Her Majesty's government authorized the establishment of the information grid, a network of wire-linked interpreters stretching from Ottawa to Cairo, Bombay to Melbourne. And yet, no one quite knew what they had created. The early terminals were built into post offices and customs houses. They were massive, noisy, and temperamental, operated by specialized technicians known as conductors. These were neither soldiers nor scribes. They were half mathematician, half oracle. They translated information between human logic and machine. Rhythm, inserting punch cards into clockwork readers, interpreting encoded missives through patterned holes and flashing semaphores. A good conductor could route a message across 5 colonies in half an hour. A great one could rewrite history with a missing card. It was said that the hum of a busy terminal sounded like a cathedral bell ringing backwards in darkened city halls. Gears turned, coils sparked, and memory became metal. And so the world changed, not with a bang, but with a pulse. At first, the information grid was a utility, a faster telegraph, a better bureaucracy. But it did not remain that way. The machines evolved. Plus so did the people who used them. By 1855, Bain's relays had been miniaturized and improved by engineers across Europe and the Americas. New metals, insulated tubing, and pressure-tuned conductors allowed longer transmissions with fewer errors. Message length increased through Lovelace's refinements in recursive logic. Interpreters could now handle not just static messages, but queries with embedded conditions, requests for data with specific parameters, and even rudimentary decision. Trees dotted was no longer just the transfer of information. It was computation across distance. The term Ethernet first appeared in the satirical pamphlet. The brass dispatch meant to mock the growing obsession with wire communication. One day, all of London shall vanish into this blasted Ethernet. It joked, and will speak no more than taps and holes. But within months, the term stuck. What had been the information grid became the Ethernet, a poetic suggestion that information moved not through ground, but through something higher, something ambient and invisible. The British government formalized the name in the Imperial Pulse Act of 1858, which commissioned thousands of kilometers of insulated cabling and underground conduits across the empire. These lines were not just laid under the ground, they were laid into the bones of civilization. Cities tore up streets to embed transmission lines. Ports installed brass receivers into their customs gates. New buildings were required to reserve logic alcoves, spaces for interpreter installations, maintenance ducts, and script stations. The pulse became the empire's bloodstream. But what truly unlocked the systems? Potential wasn't the machines. It was the people who mastered them. A new class emerged. The streamers. Streamers were the elite users of the Ethernet. Polymaths who spoke in code dialects, understood logic loops, and could send dynamic data flows between nodes without error. They wore sigils, copper brooches shaped like punch cards or rotating glyphs, and carried encrypted identification scrolls. Some were born nobility, but most were self-made, rising through aptitude tests and sponsorships by knowledge guilds. To be a streamer was to belong to a society above borders. They attended salons where debates were conducted entirely via real-time scroll relays. They composed poetry in conditional logic. They built reputations through peer-reviewed transmission threads stored on mirrored copper discs in knowledge vaults around the world. And what they valued above all else was access. Access to knowledge banks, access to transmission hubs, access to history itself. Libraries were digitized, that is, encoded through compression cards and stored on steam rotary disks. Museums published schematic blueprints of their contents, allowing streamers in Singapore to experience the British Museum's layout, object metadata, and curator commentary, all through a scroll-fed viewpane. Meanwhile, the silence, those without skills or permissions to use the stream, watched from below. They queued for public digest terminals. They received weekly summary broadsheets printed from the node's overflow buffer brief, simplified interpretations of the week's major events, stripped of nuance and detail. The silence could not query, they could only consume, and so a quiet apartheid formed. Wealth no longer depended solely on land or inheritance. It was measured in bandwidth, in priority slots on the network, in query credits, which determined how often you could ask questions of the system. A merchant with a low-grade token might be allowed one market forecast per week. A duke or a top-level streamer could issue recursive inquiries on commodities across 5 continents in real time. Knowledge was money. Insight was leverage. Those who controlled the flow of information could decide markets before they moved. The Ministry of Stream, formed in 1861, regulated usage. On the surface, it claimed to protect the public from network abuse. In truth, it was a gatekeeper. It licensed node access, taxed personal terminals, and issued streamer credentials through a Byzantine evaluation system known as the lexicon. Trials.education changed almost overnight. No longer was it enough to recite Latin and quote Cicero. Children in the elite academies now learned code dialects, structural glyphs based on Lovelacean syntax. They memorized recursive formulas, practiced logic games, and composed modular essays where conclusions branched depending on reader input. Ethics classes debated whether a conditional loop was a form of manipulation or moral adaptation outside the academies. Common schools struggled. They received simplified lesson threads pushed from district nodes, modules without dynamic interaction. Teachers, unable to query or revise the material, taught from outdated logic chains. And so the gap widened further. Cultural tension mounted. In Edinburgh, a group of dissenting scholars published the Syntax Manifesto, accusing the ministry of intellectual tyranny and demanding open access, the right of all citizens to query the network freely. The ministry dismissed it as a fringe pamphlet, but the public responded. Silent protests swept London. Factory workers walked in pairs, mimicking the data pairing process of dual-socket nodes. Farmers in the Midlands refused to accept weather projections until public terminals were upgraded. The streamers scoffed. Let the blind demand lenses, one famously wrote in a satire thread. But not all streamers were blind to injustice. A splinter group, calling themselves the Patriots, began uploading free educational modules through unlicensed relays. These rogue packets, often embedded within encoded hymnals or crop reports, taught readers how to construct basic query loops, repair card readers, and even hijack low-priority channels. In 1865, the first public query tree was launched in Manchester. Installed in a public square, it resembled a bronze sculpture, a tree whose leaves were etched with logical statements. Beneath it stood a punch terminal with rotating glyph slots. Anyone, child, laborer, or scholar, could pose a question to the local node and receive an answer within the hour. The ministry tried to dismantle it. The people built 10 more. The stream, like all great systems, began to shift from tool to battleground. By the late 1860s, the Ethernet was no longer confined to London or even the European continent. It had become the empire's invisible architecture, a system of tendrils reaching across oceans, deserts, and jungles. Steamships no longer simply carried cargo. They laid copper lines and reinforced tubes as they went, dropping relay buoys and underwater capsules packed with pressure-regulated coils. Alongside every new telegraph line came a sister set of nodes, designed not just for transmission, but for storage, retrieval, and computation. This was the true face of colonial expansion in the age of information. No longer did the empire rely solely on red-coated troops or silver-backed currency. Now, it conquered by connectivity. The imperial nodes, once located in metropolises like London or Delhi, were installed in port cities and administrative outposts. Zanzibar, Batavia, Rangoon, Kingston, in dusty archives and storm-swept towers. Interpreters hummed beneath the British flag, passing everything from tax reports to coded confessions of rebellion. Missionaries carried portable gospel terminals on their backs, heavy, brass-bound, machines powered by manual cranks and pressure cells. A single unit could recite the Sermon on the Mount in 14 languages and encode it for instant dispatch to a cardinal or queen. Local converts were trained to operate the devices, their roles shifting from spiritual intermediaries to proto-programmers. One priest in the Andes claimed he brought 2,000 souls to Christ using nothing but punch cards and patience. But colonized voices soon turned the tools against their makers. In Calcutta, Bengali scholars intercepted packets from the viceroy's office and published falsified orders in public terminals. In Lagos, Engineers embedded anti-colonial poems into maintenance reports, their rhymes recursive, looping endlessly until the machines stalled. In the Philippines, revolutionaries encoded logistical instructions into recipes shared between villages. British authorities thought they were reading Kori variations. In fact, they were reading war plans. The British responded with information discipline. Newly established transmission oversight corps recruited conductors and analysts from elite schools, shipping them to outposts with strict instructions, throttle non-compliant traffic, censor sedition, quarantine dynamic queries. Nodes were armed with redlock protocols, override codes that could forcibly disconnect any branch from the stream. But repression always breeds innovation. The colonies adapted, lacking resources. They became brilliant in compression. Indian coders pioneered zero-state looping, a method of transmitting vast content through minimal glyphs. Caribbean poets merged oral tradition with signal modulation, allowing entire ballads to be packed into single pulses. In Nairobi, students wrote alternate histories into stream updates, slowly rewriting the narrative of the empire from within its own archives. They had a name for this: pulse-jacking. Pulse-jackers didn't just disrupt transmissions, they altered them at the root, leaving no trace but changed memory. A missionary might quote scripture only to find the passage now included subversive proverbs. A general might receive orders, unaware they had been rewritten by a rogue conductor to nodes. Upstream, by 1875, the British Empire found itself in a crisis of control. The flow of information had grown too fast, too vast, and too complex to police by traditional means. The Ministry of Stream, once a beacon of order, was now a bureaucracy bloated beyond repair, issuing contradictory edicts, blocking itself, chasing ghosts. And from the chaos rose new heroes. In Punjab, a revolutionary code writer, known only as Ronnie Lakshmi 2.0, gained notoriety for hijacking Node 14, the core routing hub for northern India. Her stream parrots redirected entire military shipments to villages, forged clemency orders, and leaked internal communications in poetic verse. Let the Queen read her empire in couplets, she famously wrote. Her identity remained unknown, though many claimed she wore a skirt laced with copper wiring and a brass-plated pistol strapped to her thigh across the ocean. In the Irish Hills, the coders of Cork launched a decentralized publication network called the Recursive Gale, distributing anti-imperial folklore disguised as software updates. Their streams crashed nodes, not by force, but by contradiction. Recursive structures, so elegantly built they triggered logic loops that shut entire networks down in self-defense. The Empire's answer was as inevitable as it was ruthless. The Bureau of Transmission Security, BTS. Formed in 1881, the BTS was given extraordinary power. Surveillance terminals were installed in every major node, listening engines, massive analytics servers fueled by steam and human labor were embedded deep beneath London, calibrated to detect patterns of seditious structure. not content with scanning language. They analyzed syntax, rhythm, query shape, even the emotional arc of a message. One flagged document was rejected because the tone was too triumphant for a tax report. By 1885, the concept of message integrity had entered law. It was no longer just illegal to publish false information. It was a crime to transmit emotion that did not match approved content. The courts invented a new offense: syntactic sedition. Hundreds were arrested, not for what they said, but for how their messages felt. Conductors began to disappear. Query credits were revoked. Codebooks were revised to eliminate nuance. The stream, once a place of infinite possibility, now groaned under the weight of its own paranoia. And yet, the current could not be stopped in a quiet corner of Sussex. A man named Alan Lovelace, son of Ada, an inheritor of her genius, created the Lovelace lock, a cipher system so intricate it required not just a key, but a contextual signature, tone, query order, intent. It could adapt mid-transmission, shift languages, and embed itself invisibly within other messages. With it, secure communication was reborn. Soon, diplomats used it. So did dissidents. And so did everyday people. School teachers, lovers, parents. A mother might use it to send a lullaby to her son in another province. A teacher might encrypt a lesson in logic behind a recipe for soup. It was information, made sacred again. By the dawn of the 20th century, the world had become a tapestry of terminals. Cities pulsed not just with steam and commerce, but with data. Ethernet, once a tool of empire, had become the nervous system of civilization. Trade relied on it. Governments fed on it. Revolutions germinated in it. Culture spread through its veins like electricity through copper. But even as it connected the world, it also destabilized it. No single authority could contain it. Not anymore. The collapse began with a whisper, a spoofed credential, passed through 3 relays and 1 mirrored node. It arrived at the heart of the Austro-Hungarian Stream Authority in June of 1914. To the untrained eye, it was genuine. It bore the Archduke's crest, his syntax structure, even his cadence of punctuation. But it wasn't real. Within hours. Orders were transmitted to the Serbian Ministry of Defense, declarations of war, calls for mobilization, permissions for preemptive strikes. Serbia, stunned, responded in kind. Other nodes, chained by treaty-encoded logic, responded automatically. No human had time to verify. Within 36 hours, half of Europe was mobilized. The war had begun, not with a bullet, but with a bit. This was not merely a war of nations. It was a war of information. Terminals became fortresses. Servers were bombed like arsenals. Undersea cables were cut by saboteurs in diving suits. Troops advanced based on forged coordinates, only to be ambushed where they thought allies waited. The term stream collapse entered the lexicon. The moment when a node, overloaded or compromised, buckled, causing days of blackouts across entire regions. Hospitals lost patient records. Factories halted mid-production. Military orders conflicted, split, reversed. Truth became fluid. New military divisions emerged. The scripters, elite code engineers trained in sabotage and viral recursion, were embedded into frontline command, armed with nothing but punch dials and encrypted K-wheels. They could breach logic loops or inject hallucination scripts, false battlefield reports designed to fracture morale. Opposing them were the patches, battlefield logicians who raced to seal vulnerabilities in real time. Their command tents were filled with steam terminals and pneumatic valves, directing the battle not with bullets, but with syntax. One missed semicolon could undo an entire maneuver. And then there were the null squads, shock units, trained to destroy physical infrastructure. They carried EMP grenades powered by collapsing steam vacuums. Their job was simple: eliminate the node, break the relay, cut the memory. The war reached its crescendo during the Battle of Verdenstream in 1916, not just a physical siege, but a digital one. 3,000 coders on each side fought in collapsing French node clusters. For 4 days, logic barrages were exchanged across steam-linked terminals. Syntax trees were burned. Routing pathways collapsed. At one point, both sides launched simultaneous recursion floods, the equivalent of mental artillery, causing network blackouts across 3 nations. 12 Codrites died from data collapse, their neural augment systems fried by unchecked feedback loops. Dozens more suffered hallucinations as overflow buffers spilled into their cognitive implants. Meanwhile, civilians panicked in disconnected towns. A syndrome emerged: stream blackout syndrome, cognitive trauma caused by the sudden loss of informational stability. With no updates, no verification, people turned on neighbors. Rumors of betrayal, famine, invasion spread like plague. Entire villages rioted over falsified food drops that never arrived. The war's horrors extended beyond battlefields. Diplomatic delegations were corrupted mid-transit, their identities spoofed, intentions misinterpreted. At least 2 treaties collapsed because a single clause had been re-encoded by a rogue glyph downstream. One unintended negotiation led to the siege of Krakow, lasting 6 unnecessary weeks. It became clear the Ethernet had given humanity something too powerful, too fast, too vulnerable to error and malice. The war didn't end with a surrender. It ended with a patch dot in 1919, beneath a mountain in neutral Switzerland. Representatives from every warring power met not to sign documents, but to co-write a solution. They called it the Bletchley Protocols. No pens, no paper, just terminals, plattering, steaming, encrypted as diplomats and engineers worked side by side. Every line of text was reviewed by opposing validators. Every clause was verment controlled. They didn't write a treaty. They wrote a system. The result was the Geneva Codex, The first global charter on information sovereignty, it declared that truth was a public utility, that manipulation of identity or information without consent constituted a war crime, that network access was a human right, that no single entity could own more than 10% of global nodes, that open source verification would be mandatory for all international messages, and finally, that information, like water, like air, belonged to everyone. The Ethernet, once a battlefield, became a commons. Governance changed overnight. Nations reorganized themselves around protocol allegiances, not geography. People began declaring digital citizenship based on systems of governance they believed in. These new alliances became known as the net states. Among them, CommerceNet, a global, capital-driven node system where trade and profit were streamlined through smart contracts and adaptive market loops. The Free Data Collective, a decentralized anarcho-coding ecosystem governed by consensus and transparency, where knowledge was the only currency. Sine Stream, a Confucian system built on meritocratic logic, social harmony, and centralized flow control. Idocraft, an network state, where citizenship was earned through contribution to learning repositories and peer instruction. Borders blurred. Embassies became data centers. Diplomacy happened in Cawthorne threads, not treaties. Conflict, when it came, was measured in latency, not blood. The world had been battered, humbled, rebuilt, and in rebuilding it found something like peace. The scars of war never fully faded, but neither did the momentum of creation. Out of the smoldering wreckage of miscommunication and manipulated truth came a new kind of optimism, one forged not in fire, but in clarity. With the Geneva Codex as its moral anchor, the world entered a new era, the age of alignment. By the 1920s, every child born within a net state received a digital passport at birth, not a name alone, but a stream-verified identity, cryptographically linked to a personal syntax ledger. It could not be forged, could not be stolen, and grew with them like a second skin. Children were taught stream talk, a simplified, logical language built on Lovelacean syntax and adapted for early cognitive development. Before they could write poems, they could compose queries. Schools gave each student a knowledge key, a rotating punch dial linked to curated education libraries. Lessons adjusted based on comprehension patterns, branching into new topics when curiosity was detected. Across the globe, complonges replaced cafes, outfitted with velvet armchairs, mirrored viewpanes, and warm brass terminals. They became havens for debate, discovery, and dreamers. People gathered to pass essays together, co-author plays, or navigate the archives of 6 continents with a single question. Art transformed. The 1932 Code Biennale in Florence became a cultural landmark. Stream-synced orchestras played compositions created by 4 composers from different countries, live and in harmony. Recursive theatre troupes performed plays that shifted their narratives each night, depending on the audience's real-time input. dancers in snow palo choreographed movements based on crowd-generated data threads. In Lagos, the Pulse Art School trained a new generation of creative codwrights who combined oral tradition, musical recursion, and visual glyphcraft. Their work wasn't just beautiful, it responded to the viewer, reacting to their queries, mood, or presence in the room. New faiths blossomed, not to replace the old, but to transcend them. The most influential was the Book of Code, authored by philosopher-cryptographer Alina Weber, a child of stream refugees and self-taught coder priest. Her treatise became a global touchstone for ethical transmission and verification. It taught not dogma, but responsibility. Her opening line adorned the gates of 1,000 academies. All that is transmitted is not true, but all that is true must be transmitted. The Book of Code inspired civic movements, open-source religions, even judicial reform. Courts began requiring digital co-signatures on rulings, each verified by citizen validators. No more hidden verdicts. Every justice system became part of the stream, transparent, accountable, immutable. But utopia was never complete. Despite advances, the stream divide endured. In remote islands, mountain communities, and war-torn regions, access lagged. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa and inner Southeast Asia, children still shared single-punch terminals among villages. They made do repurposing broken machines, building node boosters from scrap metal and glass lenses. From these margins came the stream, sovereignty movement. They demanded the right to control local knowledge flows, to run indigenous nodes in native dialects, to preserve data according to cultural values, not Western compression standards, to opt out of surveillance, of universal formatting, of infinite searchability. Their motto was whispered in queues and painted on terminals. Our minds are not metadata. At first, the global councils resisted, then they listened. A decade-long negotiation, the Great Debate of 1945, convened the largest consensus forum in stream history. 3 planetary time zones. Over 500 million real-time participants. The topic, the nature of knowledge itself. They argued, streamed, translated, debated. Should privacy be absolute? Should historical edits be allowed? Can emotional nuance be preserved in logic dialect? Who owns the past? Who shapes the future? After 10 days of recursive discourse, the consensus thread was signed by 97% of node governors, syndicate leaders, coders, philosophers, and citizens. It established universal stream accessing encrypted personal archives, cultural format, autonomous, sovereign to redundant, independent stream channels for all the world. Didn't become perfect, but it became honest. By the 1960s, fusion power had revolutionized computation. Ethernet nodes no longer hissed and clanked. They glowed softly in glass towers and river basins. Signal reach extended to Mars by 1980, where the first Martian node was named after Ada Lovelace. Colonists queried Earth archives to design biodomes and poetry curricula alike. In 2001, weather-stabilizing algorithms adjusted global patterns to mitigate flooding and drought. By 2020, food distribution was automated via flow-based logic trees that reduced waste by 87%. The Ethernet had become not just memory, but metabolism. And now, in the year 2025, we live in two worlds at once, the tactile and the streamed. We speak to one another through light, breath, signal, and sentiment. We live with ghosts, digital legacies preserved through memory shards and consented simulation. We study history not through textbooks, but by navigating versioned perspectives of past events, preserved in scrollable memory cubes. Each year, the world celebrates Streamlight, a festival honoring the first global patch, the birth of open flow. Citizens of all net states gather in augmented plazas, share inventions, recite logic poetry, play collaborative code games, and honor those lost in the information wars. In the sky, drones arrange themselves into tribute glyphs, the infinity loop of the ministry of stream, the cursive eye of the Petrites, the 3-bar key of Alan Lovelace, and somewhere in a public square in Manchester, the query tree still stands, refurbished, replated in bronze, with a new engraving. This is where the questions began. Children gather to ask it things, sometimes about math, sometimes about dinosaurs, sometimes about loss. And the tree answers, not always with facts, but with paths, with links, with light, because the stream is not simply a tool. It is not a government, or a memory vault, or a ledger of transactions. The stream is humanity's attempt to listen to itself. It began in soot and steam. It passed through war and wire. It now lives in everyone. And perhaps, just perhaps, in this world we built a little too early, with copper and brass instead of circuits and chips. We learned just in time what it means to be connected.